In the winding streets of Renaissance Florence, power didn't always wear a crown. It signed checks. From a modest banking house, the Medici family built an empire of influence that stretched from merchant stalls to the papal throne. They never ruled as kings, yet their words shaped laws, their gold funded wars, and their patronage birthed masterpieces. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Botticelli, all flourished under Medici favor. For popes bore their name. Two queens of France carried their blood. Behind velvet curtains and marble halls, the Medicis pulled the strings of Europe's most powerful institutions. But how did a family of bankers become the architects of an age? And what legacy did they leave in the vaults of history? In the 14th century, Florence was a city of contradictions. Its narrow streets teemed with merchants, craftsmen, and bankers, yet its piazzas were adorned with Gothic churches and palaces that spoke of immense wealth and ambition. Behind every archway and every shadowed alley lingered a reminder of the city's turbulent character. Florence was both cradle of art and furnace of intrigue. Amid this ferment, a family of modest beginnings began its steady ascent to power, a dynasty that would come to shape not only Florence but much of Europe, the Medici. The Medici origins were humble. The family hailed from the Mugello Valley, a rural region north of Florence where they worked as small-time money changers and wool merchants. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, born in 1360, proved to be the pivotal figure who would set the Medici on the path to dominance. Unlike other nobles who flaunted wealth through displays of feasting and ostentation, Giovanni cultivated an air of modesty, even humility, while quietly amassing influence through shrewd business practices. He transformed the Medici Bank into the most respected financial institution in Europe by adhering to one principle above all: trust. In an age where banking was still tainted by the stigma of usury, Giovanni found ways to cloak transactions in legitimacy. Loans were disguised as currency exchanges. Interest was embedded in fees rather than charged openly. Through clever maneuvering, the Medici Bank became the preferred banker of merchants, princes, and most importantly, the Papacy. By aligning his financial empire with the Church, Giovanni not only secured legitimacy, but also bound the fate of Florence to Rome. When Pope John XI needed money, he turned to the Medici. When cathedral projects stalled, Giovanni's bank advanced the funds. Money, piety, and power converged under his watchful eye. Yet Giovanni was more than a banker. He was a political tactician. In Florence, power was not won on the battlefield, but in the intricate balance of the Republic's republican institutions. The city prided itself on its civic liberties, but behind the facade of republicanism, oligarchies rose and fell in cycles of rivalry. Giovanni recognized that wealth alone was insufficient. Patronage, alliances, and the subtle shaping of public opinion were equally crucial. He avoided direct confrontation with rivals, preferring to build networks quietly. He funded public works, supported the Wool Guild, and ensured that the Medici name was associated with civic good. This combination of discretion and generosity won him allies across the social spectrum. By the time of his death in 1429, Giovanni had secured not only wealth but a reputation that made the Medici indispensable to Florence. He was buried without pomp, his epitaph declaring him a friend to the poor rather than a prince of finance. Yet his modest tomb belied the dynasty he had forged. His sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo, would inherit not merely a bank but the blueprint for transforming money into power and power into legacy. Cosimo de' Medici, later known as Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, was the true architect of the Medici Dynasty. Where Giovanni had been cautious, Cosimo was expansive. He inherited a banking empire that stretched across Europe from London to Bruges, Venice to Avignon, with branches that facilitated trade and diplomacy alike. But Cosimo understood that Florence, with its fractious families and jealous guilds, could not be ruled by naked ambition. Instead, he wielded power indirectly, mastering the art of influence. He avoided public titles of grandeur, preferring to be seen as a citizen among citizens, even as he controlled the machinery of state from the shadows. Cosimo's genius lay not only in politics, but in his understanding of culture as power. He recognized that Florence's identity was inseparable from art, philosophy, and learning. To invest in culture was to invest in legitimacy. Under his patronage, the great cathedral dome, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, rose as a marvel of engineering, a symbol of Florence's genius and the Medici's benevolence. He funded monasteries, libraries, and academies, ensuring that his family was linked with the intellectual rebirth we now call the Renaissance. When scholars fled Constantinople after its fall in 1453, Cosimo welcomed them to Florence, seeding the city with classical texts that would inspire a new age of humanism. Yet Cosimo's rule was not without peril. Rival families such as the Albizzi and the Strozzi sought to bring him down. In 1433, he was briefly exiled, accused of tyranny. But exile revealed the breadth of his influence. Florence floundered without his financial support, and within a year he was recalled triumphantly. This episode crystallized his role. Florence needed Cosimo more than Cosimo needed Florence. By the time of his death in 1464, the Medici had moved beyond banking into a realm where their word carried the weight of law, though they held no official crown. The birth of the Medici Dynasty was thus not a sudden seizure of power, but a careful weaving of threads. Money, piety, art, and politics. Giovanni had laid the foundation with prudence. Cosimo had raised the edifice with brilliance. Together, they transformed the Medici from provincial merchants into uncrowned kings of Florence. Their story was only beginning, but already the contours of a dynasty were clear: rule without titles, dominate without seeming to govern, and bind power to beauty so deeply that the two became indistinguishable. The Medici had emerged as masters of Florence, but their ambitions would stretch further still, to Rome, to the Papacy, to Europe itself. From their modest banking counters in Mugello, they had stepped into history, and history, once touched by their hand, would never be the same. Cosimo de' Medici's life was a paradox. A man who never wore a crown, yet wielded power greater than most kings. In a republic that prided itself on liberty, Cosimo became the hidden axis around which Florence turned. He achieved this not through armies or decrees, but through the subtler instruments of wealth, alliances, and patronage. To understand Cosimo is to understand how banking could become sovereignty, how money, when deployed with vision, could shape not only politics but the very imagination of a civilization. When Giovanni di Bicci died in 1429, Cosimo inherited not only one of Europe's wealthiest banks, but also a delicate balance of power in Florence. The Albizzi family dominated the city's politics, suspicious of any rival influence. Florence's governing council, the Signoria, was filled with men hostile to Medici expansion. Yet Cosimo's reputation as a generous patron of churches and guilds gave him allies among artisans and merchants. He understood that Florence was not ruled by force, but by consensus, and consensus could be purchased, sometimes with coin, sometimes with goodwill, and often with both. The Medici Bank under Cosimo became the economic engine of Florence. Its branches stretched across Europe: Bruges, Venice, London, Rome, Avignon. Each office served as more than a financial outpost. It was an embassy, a node in a network that connected Florence to the courts of kings and popes. Money moved not merely as capital, but as influence. When princes borrowed, they became indebted not just financially, but politically. When the papacy entrusted its accounts to the Medici, it cemented a relationship that elevated Florence from a regional power to a spiritual and financial center of Christendom. Cosimo knew that banking alone would not secure his family's place in history. Wealth breeds envy, and envy breeds enemies. The Albizzi family saw him as a threat, and, in 1433, orchestrated his arrest. Accused of tyranny and corruption, Cosimo was sentenced to exile, a punishment often harsher than death for Florentines, whose lives were bound to the city's walls. Yet exile revealed his true power. From Venice, where he resided, Cosimo continued to bankroll allies in Florence, starving the government of credit. Within a year, Florence's economy faltered, and the Albizzi regime collapsed under its own weight. Cosimo was recalled in triumph, greeted as a savior by citizens who saw in him not a tyrant, but a stabilizer of the republic. From that moment forward, Cosimo was the unacknowledged ruler of Florence. He held no office that would mark him as sovereign, but every decision, from taxation to foreign alliances, bore his imprint. He filled the signoria with allies through patronage, marriages, and financial favors. His enemies found themselves marginalized or ruined, while his supporters thrived. Yet Cosimo never flaunted his dominance. He dressed simply, walked without guards, and maintained the facade of a humble citizen. His motto was, "Envy is a weed that should not be watered." He cultivated the appearance of modesty while exercising unmatched authority. But perhaps Cosimo's most enduring contribution was his investment in culture. He understood that patronage of art and scholarship was not charity, it was strategy. Florence, a city of merchants, needed symbols of greatness that transcended trade. Cosimo funded Filippo Brunelleschi's dome for the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, a project so audacious that it seemed impossible until completed. The dome rose as a miracle of engineering and a beacon of Medici vision. Beneath its arches, Florence stood united in pride, and the Medici name became synonymous with progress and magnificence. Cosimo also founded the Platonic Academy, inviting scholars to translate and study ancient Greek texts rescued from the fall of Constantinople. In those dialogues, Florence rediscovered Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, fueling the philosophy of humanism that became the intellectual backbone of the Renaissance. In Cosimo's libraries, manuscripts replaced swords as instruments of power, and ideas became currency. The Renaissance, so often attributed to the genius of artists and thinkers, was also the fruit of Cosimo's coffers. His patronage extended beyond art to public works. He financed convents, monasteries, and hospitals, ensuring that the poor associated the Medici with charity. His spending was immense, so much so that by the end of his life, he had nearly bankrupted himself. But this, too, was a calculation. For Cosimo, wealth was not to be hoarded but transmuted into influence, prestige, and legacy. He once remarked that states are not maintained with paternosters. Prayers alone do not secure power. Resources must be directed with purpose. Florence under Cosimo was not without turbulence. Wars with Milan and Venice strained the Republic. Plague returned in cycles, thinning populations and stoking fear. Yet through it all, Cosimo steered Florence with a steady hand, maintaining alliances that prevented its destruction and ensuring that, unlike many Italian states, Florence remained a hub of creativity and stability. When Cosimo died in 1464, the city mourned as if for a monarch. The bells tolled not just for a banker, but for the man who had become the living embodiment of Florence. He was buried in the Church of San Lorenzo, a monument funded by his own wealth, though his tomb bore no crown. The Republic, in gratitude, bestowed upon him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Cosimo's reign marked the Medici's transformation from merchants into rulers without titles. His genius lay in his ability to combine wealth with restraint, to dominate without provoking rebellion, and to recognize that art and ideas could serve as pillars of political authority. The city he left behind was no longer merely Florence. It was the beating heart of a cultural revolution that would echo across Europe. And behind its pulse was the Medici hand, steady and unseen. Cosimo de' Medici proved that power need not wear a crown to be absolute. His legacy would be tested by his descendants, who inherited both his empire and his enemies. For in Florence, envy was never far behind, and the dynasty he built would soon face trials of intrigue, betrayal, and blood. If Cosimo had been the architect of Medici power, Lorenzo de' Medici was its grand performer. Known to history as Lorenzo il Magnifico, he was not merely a banker or politician but a statesman, poet, and patron whose charisma transformed Florence into the glittering capital of the Renaissance. Unlike Cosimo, who preferred to move in the shadows, Lorenzo embraced visibility. He understood that to hold Florence, one had to embody its ideals of brilliance, refinement, and strength. He became not just the ruler of a republic, but the spirit of an age. Lorenzo was born in 1449 into a family already synonymous with power. His grandfather Cosimo had laid the foundations of Medici dominance, and his father, Piero, had maintained them. But it was Lorenzo's education that marked him for greatness. Tutors steeped him in the classics, teaching him Greek and Latin, philosophy and rhetoric, poetry, and politics. He grew up surrounded by artists and thinkers, absorbing the belief that Florence was destined to be more than a city of commerce. It was a city of destiny. From an early age, Lorenzo was groomed to rule not as a king, but as something subtler, the first citizen of a republic that cloaked its oligarchy in the garments of liberty. When Piero died in 1469, the 20-year-old Lorenzo inherited the reins of power. He did so with the confidence of one who believed himself chosen by fate. He moved with ease among merchants, nobles, and scholars alike, his wit and charm disarming even those who despised Medici dominance. Unlike his predecessors, who maintained the facade of modest bankers, Lorenzo lived with magnificence, hunting, jousting, writing poetry, and hosting feasts that dazzled his contemporaries. To his allies, this display was the rightful splendor of Florence's leader. To his enemies, it was arrogance and provocation. But beneath the pageantry lay shrewd calculation. Lorenzo understood that the wealth of the Medici Bank was waning, strained by wars and mismanagement. To preserve Medici power, he turned increasingly to politics and culture rather than finance. His vision was to make Florence the unrivaled capital of art and intellect, ensuring that its glory, and by extension his own, would outshine rival courts. Thus, he summoned to Florence a constellation of genius: Leonardo da Vinci, still young and restless; Sandro Botticelli, whose brush would capture the ethereal grace of Venus; and Michelangelo, whom Lorenzo discovered as a boy and welcomed into his household as if he were his own son. Under Lorenzo, art was no longer mere decoration. It was propaganda, a living testament to the greatness of Florence and the Medici. The frescoes, sculptures, and paintings commissioned during his rule projected an image of harmony and divine favor. Florence became a stage, and its beauty a mirror of Lorenzo's authority. To the world, the Medici appeared not as mere bankers, but as stewards of civilization itself. Yet politics was never far from the surface. Florence was surrounded by powerful rivals: Milan, Venice, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. Each sought to dominate the Italian peninsula, and Florence risked being swallowed in the struggle. Lorenzo became not only Florence's cultural patron, but its diplomat and protector. His greatest achievement was the delicate balance of power known as the Peace of Lodi, which kept the Italian states in fragile harmony. He traveled tirelessly, negotiating alliances, soothing tensions, and projecting Florence's influence far beyond its walls. But greatness attracts envy, and Lorenzo's enemies plotted to undo him. Among them were the Papacy family, wealthy bankers who resented Medici control, and Pope Sixtus IV, who saw in Lorenzo an obstacle to papal ambitions. In 1478, during Easter Mass in the Cathedral of Florence, the conspirators struck. As the bells rang, assassins attacked Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano before the high altar. Giuliano was stabbed to death, his body left bleeding on the marble floor. Lorenzo, slashed across the neck, escaped into the sacristy, saved by his quick thinking and loyal supporters. The Papacy conspiracy, as it became known, shook Florence to its core. Citizens rioted, seizing the conspirators and hanging them from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. Lorenzo emerged not weakened but stronger, his survival interpreted as divine favor. The Republic rallied around him, and his enemies were vanquished. Yet the conspiracy also revealed the fragility of Medici power and the lengths to which rivals would go to destroy them. After the conspiracy, Lorenzo ruled with greater authority, abandoning even the pretense of republican equality. He centralized power in his hands, ensuring that nothing of importance occurred without his sanction. Yet he did so with such elegance that many Florentines accepted his dominance as the natural order. He was not a tyrant in the crude sense. He was a prince in all but name, embodying Machiavelli's later observation that Florence had been ruled by a man who held the reins of government firmly, but without legal title. Lorenzo's final years were marked by both triumph and decline. The Medici Bank, once the powerhouse of Europe, collapsed under debts and mismanagement. Lorenzo, more concerned with politics and art than accounting, allowed the family's financial empire to wither. Yet paradoxically, as the Medici wealth declined, their political and cultural power soared. The investments Lorenzo had made in art and diplomacy bore fruit, ensuring that Florence remained secure and dazzling in its brilliance. In 1492, Lorenzo died at the age of 43, his body ravaged by illness. Florence wept, for with his passing the city lost more than a ruler. It lost its magnificence. His death marked the end of an era, for within years Florence would face invasion, turmoil, and the rise of the fiery preacher Savonarola, who sought to purge the city of the very splendors Lorenzo had cultivated. But history remembers Lorenzo not for the bank he lost or the enemies he made, but for the Renaissance he helped ignite. He transformed Florence into a workshop of genius, where art, poetry, and philosophy converged in a blaze of creativity. His legacy was not measured in coins but in marble and canvas, in the enduring works of Michelangelo and Botticelli, in the humanist ideals that spread across Europe. Lorenzo de' Medici was indeed magnificent, not because he wore a crown, but because he redefined what it meant to rule. He was the prince without a throne, the sovereign of a republic, the man who proved that power could be exercised through beauty as much as through fear. His reign was the zenith of the Medici Dynasty, and his shadow would linger long after his passing, a reminder that greatness often comes not from titles, but from vision. The death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492 cast a long shadow over Florence. His passing left not merely a vacancy of leadership, but a vacuum of vision. The balance he had maintained between diplomacy, art, and politics collapsed with him, and into this void swept forces that would test the very foundations of Medici power. Without Lorenzo's commanding presence, Florence became a city adrift, vulnerable to its enemies and torn apart by its own conscience. The Magnificent had ruled not with laws, but with charisma, and now that charisma was gone. Lorenzo's heir was his son Piero, nicknamed Piero the Unfortunate, and the title was Apartment. Unlike his father, Piero lacked subtlety, intellect, and foresight. He inherited power, but not the skill to wield it. Where Lorenzo had charmed enemies into friends, Piero antagonized allies into adversaries. His rule coincided with a dangerous moment in European history, the rise of France's Charles VIII, a young king whose ambitions reached into Italy. Charles dreamed of reclaiming the Kingdom of Naples, and to do so he would march his armies through the Italian peninsula. For Florence, this was a crisis of survival, requiring the kind of statesmanship Lorenzo had mastered. Piero, however, proved disastrously incapable. When Charles invaded in 1494, Piero sought to negotiate, but his concessions were humiliating. He ceded fortresses and treasures without resistance, effectively surrendering Florence's dignity. To the proud citizens of the Republic, this was unforgivable. The same Florentines who had once accepted Lorenzo's dominance now rose against his son. In the chaos, mobs stormed the Medici palace, tearing down the family's symbols, and Piero was forced to flee. Just 2 years after Lorenzo's death, the dynasty was expelled from the city it had ruled for 60 years. Florence declared itself free, a republic once more, and the Medici seemed to vanish into exile. Yet nature abhors a vacuum, and Florence could not exist without a strong hand. Into this gap stepped a figure as different from Lorenzo as fire from water. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar with a burning vision of moral purification. He thundered from the pulpits of San Marco and Santa Maria del Fiore, denouncing the decadence of Florence and the sins of its people. To Savonarola, Lorenzo had been a false idol, and the art of the Renaissance of vanity distracting souls from salvation. He preached that Florence was the new Jerusalem, chosen by God to lead Christendom in reform, but only if it cast away luxury and embraced holy poverty. Savonarola's message electrified the city. Crowds filled the streets, singing hymns and burning objects of vanity. Cosmetics, jewelry, fine clothes, even paintings and manuscripts deemed immoral. The bonfire of the vanities became the symbol of this puritanical fervor, flames devouring the very beauty that Lorenzo had cultivated. Florence, once radiant with art and philosophy, now smoldered in the grip of religious zeal. For a time, it seemed that Savonarola's moral republic might replace the Medici forever. But extremes seldom endure. Savonarola's theocracy grew oppressive, his denunciations too fierce, his claims too audacious. He He declared himself a prophet, foretelling divine judgment. But when his prophecies faltered and his enemies multiplied, the city turned against him. In 1498, just 4 years after the Medici's expulsion, Savonarola was seized, tortured, and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, the very square where his bonfires had once blazed. His ashes were cast into the Arno, leaving Florence once again without clear leadership, torn between Republican ideals and lingering nostalgia for Medici order. Meanwhile, the Medici in exile did not fade quietly. They roamed Europe, seeking allies, leveraging their wealth and connections. Their exile hardened them, teaching that Florence could not be retaken by charm alone, but required force and strategy. Piero died in obscurity in 1503, but his younger brothers and sons carried the flame. Among them was Giovanni de' Medici, who would one day ascend as Pope Leo X, and Giuliano, who married into French royalty. Though Florence rejected them, Europe still recognized the Medici as a family of consequence. Their banking fortune might have waned, but their names still commanded weight in palaces and courts. Florence, meanwhile, was not immune to the storms sweeping Italy. The French, the Spanish, and the Holy Roman Empire all vied for dominance of the peninsula. The city became a pawn in larger struggles, its independence fragile. In this chaos, the Medici saw opportunity. They positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries, promising stability to kings and popes alike. Slowly, the exiled dynasty gathered strength. The fall after Lorenzo revealed both the fragility and resilience of Medici power. Without his brilliance, they lost their city in a storm of humiliation and zealotry. Yet their enemies underestimated the dynasty's endurance. The Medici had been bankers long before they were rulers, and bankers know that fortunes rise and fall, but can always be rebuilt with patience, networks, and timing. While Florence experimented with republics and prophets, the Medici waited, weaving new webs of influence beyond its walls. By the dawn of the 16th century, the family that had seemed destroyed was poised for a comeback greater than any could have imagined. Not only would they return to Florence, they would seize the throne of Christendom itself. The Medici had fallen into shadow, but shadows conceal more than they erase. Their exile was not an end. It was an interlude before a transformation that would elevate them from bankers and patrons into kings without crowns and popes upon thrones. The expulsion of the Medici in 1494 might have seemed the end of their dynasty, but exile is rarely final for families who have mastered the arts of survival. For the Medici, banishment from Florence was both wound and lesson. The Florentine mob had stripped them of their palaces, their treasures, and their authority, yet the very skills that had elevated them from bankers to rulers ensured they would not disappear. They carried with them not only their name, but the web of connections woven across courts, kingdoms, and the church. If Florence would not have them, Europe still would. In the years following Piero the Unfortunate's flight, the Medici splintered into branches. Some remained near Tuscany, plotting a return, while others spread across Italy and beyond, seeking refuge and opportunity. They became guests of kings, confidants of cardinals, and allies of foreign princes. Their fortunes ebbed and flowed, but they never ceased to calculate, to negotiate, and to prepare. In exile, they learned resilience. It was no longer enough to depend on Florence's goodwill. Survival demanded that they embed themselves in the larger currents of European politics. One figure above all symbolized this transformation: Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni had been groomed from youth for the church, tonsured as a child, and given a cardinal's hat at the age of just 13, a dazzling appointment that showed how far Medici influence reached even before exile. While the family's political power in Florence collapsed, Giovanni's ecclesiastical career blossomed. In Rome, he cultivated friendships, navigated papal intrigues, and used the family's lingering wealth to secure allies. His presence in the Curia ensured that the Medici name did not vanish from the corridors of influence. If Florence was lost, Rome was waiting. Exile also brought unexpected alliances. Giuliano de' Medici, Giovanni's younger brother, found himself welcomed in France, where he married into nobility and strengthened ties with the French crown. This Franco-Medici connection would prove crucial when foreign armies once again turned their gaze toward Italy. The Medici were learning to think less like Florentines and more like Europeans, embedding themselves into the dynastic web that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Alps. Yet, exile was not without suffering. The Florentine Republic, guided by shifting leaders and turbulent politics, denounced the Medici repeatedly. Their properties were seized, their symbols erased, their allies harassed. For decades, Florence tried to purge itself of their memory, only to find that the family lingered like a shadow. The citizens might have overthrown Piero, but the Medici bloodline ran too deep, their name too interwoven with Florence's own Renaissance glory to be erased entirely. The political upheavals of Italy provided constant openings. The French, the Spanish, the Holy Roman Empire all sought dominance over the fractured peninsula, and each power needed allies among the Italian states. The Medici understood this game instinctively. They positioned themselves not as powerless exiles, but as potential partners, dangling the prospect of Florentine loyalty if only they were restored. When Florence wavered between French and imperial allegiances, the Medici offered themselves as the key to stability. In the early 1500s, the winds began to shift in their favor. The Republican experiment in Florence faltered. Without the steady hand of Lorenzo or the fiery zeal of Savonarola, the city found itself divided, its politics unstable. Wars and foreign invasions left it vulnerable. Meanwhile, Giovanni de' Medici continued to rise in Rome, a cardinal with an ever-expanding circle of allies. The family's fortunes began to turn not through Florence, but through the papacy itself. The Medici had long understood that true power in Italy rested not only in city-states, but in the Vatican. If one of their own could claim the papal tiara, their exile would not just end, it would transform into supremacy. That opportunity arrived in 1513. Pope Julius II, the warrior pontiff who had marched armies and expanded papal territory, died, leaving the College of Cardinals to elect his successor. Among them stood Giovanni de' Medici, a man still young by the standards of the Curia, but already seasoned by years of political maneuvering. With support from powerful factions, his candidacy gathered momentum. The banker's son from Florence, scion of a family driven into exile, emerged as the compromise candidate who satisfied competing interests. On March 11, 1513, Giovanni was elected pope, taking the name Leo X. The Medici, long cast out of Florence, now sat upon the throne of St. Peter. Their enemies in Florence could scarcely comprehend the reversal. The family they had expelled as corrupt tyrants now wielded the highest spiritual authority in Christendom. As Leo X, Giovanni brought the Medici name to Rome's pinnacle, where money and patronage flowed more abundantly than in Florence's palaces. The family's exile had ended not with their return to Florence alone, but with their elevation to rulers of the Catholic world. From exile to papacy, the Medici demonstrated the unique durability of their dynasty. They had survived disgrace by refusing to let Florence define them. Instead, they expanded outward, binding themselves to Europe's monarchs and Rome's cardinals until even their homeland could no longer deny them. Their years in exile taught them to think globally, to see that crowns of power came in many forms, not only the civic laurels of Florence, but the triple tiara of the Vatican. The return to Florence would come soon, supported by papal authority and foreign arms. But the years of exile had already reshaped the dynasty. They were no longer merely Florentine bankers. They had become something far larger, a family whose fate was intertwined with the destiny of Europe. The elevation of Giovanni de' Medici to the papacy in 1513 was more than a triumph for a family. It was a redefinition of power itself. With the election of Pope Leo X, the Medici had crossed a threshold that few dynasties could even dream of. They had not merely survived exile, they had ascended to the pinnacle of Christendom. The triple tiara rested on the head of a man who had grown up in the palaces of Florence, who had known both the heights of luxury and the bitterness of banishment. Now, in the eyes of Europe, the Medici were no longer vulnerable bankers, subject to the whims of a mercurial republic. They were the papal family. Leo X embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of the Medici heritage. A patron of the arts in the mold of his father, Lorenzo the Magnificent, he delighted in spectacle, music, and beauty. His papacy became synonymous with grandeur, the Vatican transformed into a theater of power and culture. He poured the Church's wealth into commissions that glorified Rome, works by Raphael, the continuation of St. Peter's Basilica, and patronage for countless poets, painters, and architects. For Leo, beauty was power, and in this he echoed the Medici tradition of using art to legitimize authority. Yet such lavishness came at a price. His indulgence in magnificence strained papal finances and sowed seeds of discontent that would soon erupt into the Reformation. But beyond Rome, the papacy was also a political weapon, and Leo knew precisely how to wield it. Florence, still wobbling under Republican governance, was ripe for reconquest. The Medici had been absent for nearly 2 decades, but the memory of their former dominance lingered. With a Medici pope in Rome, the Republic found itself in an impossible position. Resistance to the Medici was now resistance to the papacy itself. The decisive moment came in 1512, even before Giovanni's election as pope, when Spanish troops, allied with papal forces, marched into Florence. The fragile Republican government collapsed, and the Medici were restored. At first, they returned under the guise of moderation, presenting themselves as stabilizers rather than tyrants. Yet behind this mask was the undeniable fact: Florence was now tethered to Rome. The Medici had regained control not by persuasion alone, but by foreign arms and papal sanction. What had once been their city by birthright was now their city by divine endorsement. With the family's return, Florence entered a new chapter, one where its autonomy was increasingly overshadowed by Rome. Giuliano de' Medici, Giovanni's younger brother, was installed as the figurehead ruler, a duke in all but name, though his reign was brief. When Giuliano died in 1516, power shifted to Lorenzo II, nephew of Pope Leo X. The Republic's institutions still existed in form, but their spirit was hollow. The Medici had learned during exile that brute authority alone was fragile. Papal legitimacy gave their rule a sanctity that no Florentine assembly could easily challenge. The reassertion of Medici power was not without resistance. Many Florentines chafed at their return, resentful of the foreign intervention that had facilitated it. Yet the balance of power in Italy made opposition nearly impossible. Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire played their great game of dominance across the peninsula, and Florence's fate was entangled within it. The Medici aligned themselves strategically, always ensuring that they were indispensable to one side or another. The family had perfected the art of survival, and Florence was the stage on which they performed their drama. In this era, the Medici identity itself began to shift. No longer simply bankers who bought influence, they had become princes of both church and state. Their wealth was not confined to Florence, but stretched across Europe, entwined with monarchies and papal treasuries. Their legitimacy was no longer a matter of civic negotiation, but of divine authority. For Florence, this meant that the city was no longer simply a republic experimenting with liberty. It was a possession, a jewel in the papal tiara. The consequences for culture were profound. Under the renewed Medici regime, Florence once again became a magnet for artists and thinkers. The family's return coincided with the flowering of high Renaissance art, fueled by the patronage of Leo X in Rome and his kin in Florence. Michelangelo, though often frustrated by Medici demands, produced works that would come to define the era. The Medici chapels and tombs became canvases upon which the family inscribed its immortality. Their control over the church in Florence allowed them to dictate not only politics but the very aesthetics of an age. Yet this brilliance was shadowed by the storm clouds of dissent. Leo X's indulgent papacy, with its fundraising through the sale of indulgences, provoked outrage in Germany. In 1517, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, sparking a movement that would fracture Christendom. Ironically, the very Medici Pope who epitomized cultural magnificence also presided over the Church's greatest crisis. As Florence basked in renewed Medici grandeur, Europe edged toward division. The Medici had returned, but they were no longer the same family that had once quietly steered Florence's republic from behind banking ledgers. They were now princely, openly dynastic, wielding crowns of spiritual and temporal power. Their exile had taught them that legitimacy required more than money. It required a divine stage, a cloak of sanctity. With Pope Leo X, they had found it. And with Florence once again in their grasp, they would continue their transformation from merchants into monarchs in all but name. The return of the Medici in the early 16th century was not merely a restoration of old privileges, but the beginning of something entirely new. Florence, once a proud republic with fiercely independent traditions, was gradually reshaped into a dynastic state, its destiny yoked to the ambitions of the Medici family. The transformation was neither instantaneous nor uncontested, but by the time Cosimo I de' Medici took power in 1537, the Republic of Florence was, for all practical purposes, a republic no longer. It was a duchy, ruled not by elected officials or citizen councils, but by a family that had elevated itself into near-monarchical status. The seeds of this transition had been planted decades earlier. When Pope Leo X and his relatives returned Florence to Medici control, they ruled with papal legitimacy, but their authority still required constant negotiation with republican institutions. The facade of shared governance was maintained through councils, assemblies, and elaborate ceremonies meant to appease Florentine pride. Yet beneath these rituals, real power was increasingly centralized in Medici hands. Each successive Medici leader, from Giuliano to Lorenzo II, tightened the grip, chipping away at Florence's political traditions. The turning point came in 1537 with the assassination of Alessandro de' Medici, a ruler whose excesses and authoritarian style had alienated many. Into this volatile vacuum stepped a young and relatively untested member of the family, Cosimo de' Medici, later known as Cosimo I. He was only 17 when thrust into power, a boy who seemed, at first, easily controllable by Florence's elites. They believed he would be a pliable figurehead, a convenient Medici face upon which they could project their own authority. They could not have been more mistaken. Cosimo I proved to be as shrewd as any of his ancestors, perhaps even surpassing them in political calculation. Unlike his forebears who had balanced republican pretense with familial ambition, Cosimo discarded illusions. He consolidated authority swiftly and ruthlessly. He raised a private army, curtailed the independence of the Florentine councils, and reduced the power of rival families. Within a few short years, Florence's centuries-old republican institutions were effectively hollowed out, their forms preserved but their substance extinguished. In 1569, his authority was formally recognized when Pope Pius V conferred upon him the title Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was more than a papal gift. It was the culmination of generations of Medici ambition. The family that had once loaned money to monarchs now stood among them, crowned not with the electoral mandate of Florence's citizens, but with the blessing of the papacy. The Medici had secured a hereditary title, transforming themselves from bankers into sovereigns, their dynasty legitimized by both political power and divine sanction. Under Cosimo I, Florence changed profoundly. The city's role as a republican experiment in governance gave way to a more conventional model of princely rule. Yet Cosimo was not merely a tyrant in the crude sense. He understood the importance of image, legacy, and culture. He fortified Florence militarily, extending Medici influence across Tuscany, and reorganized its administration to centralize power. At the same time, he invested heavily in art and architecture, commissioning works that celebrated the glory of both Florence and the Medici name. The Uffizi Gallery, originally built as government offices, was one such creation, a physical embodiment of the fusion of civic authority and family dominance. Life under the Medici dukes was a paradox. On one hand, the repression of republican liberties marked a decline in civic freedom. Political dissent was curtailed, and Florence's once vibrant tradition of public debate and open assembly was silenced. On the other hand, stability and prosperity returned to the city. The chaos of factional struggles, so common in the Republic's earlier centuries, was quelled under the strong hand of Medici dukes. Trade flourished, Florence's artisans thrived, and the city once again radiated cultural brilliance, albeit under the watchful eye of a ruling dynasty. The Medici dukes, like their banking ancestors, understood the necessity of aligning themselves with the great powers of Europe. Cosimo I married into Spanish nobility, strengthening ties with the most powerful monarchy of the day. His successors continued to weave alliances that ensured Tuscany's survival in a volatile Italy dominated by the competing ambitions of Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Florence, no longer a republic, became instead a principality deftly maneuvering between giants. For the people of Florence, the transition was complex. Nostalgia for the old republic lingered among intellectuals and exiles, who mourned the passing of civic freedom. Yet many citizens found security under the dukes preferable to the instability of factional conflict. The Medici promoted themselves not only as rulers, but as guardians of Florentine greatness, patrons of art, architecture, and scholarship. Their palaces and chapels proclaimed their legitimacy, their control reinforced by both spectacle and subtle propaganda. Cosimo's reign thus marked the true metamorphosis of the Medici identity. The family had traveled a long arc, from bankers to political brokers, from papal patrons to sovereign dukes. What had once been a family business had become a dynasty in the fullest sense, complete with titles, succession, and hereditary power. They no longer needed to hide behind the structures of the republic or cloak their influence in modesty. They were rulers by right, kings without a crown but with all the trappings of monarchy. Yet, as always with the Medici, brilliance was accompanied by shadow. Their patronage fueled some of the greatest works of Renaissance art, but their consolidation of power extinguished Florence's republican spirit. Their reign brought stability, but at the cost of liberty. The Medici dukes embodied the paradox of Renaissance politics, the belief that beauty, power, and authority could coexist, even when achieved through suppression and control. Cosimo I's consolidation of power was the foundation upon which later generations would build, but it also crystallized the transformation of Florence into something unrecognizable to its republican founders. In his rise, one sees both the triumph of Medici ambition and the end of Florence's democratic dream. The city of merchants and guilds had become the court of princes, its destiny forever intertwined with the family that had begun as bankers, but had learned to rule like kings. The Medici dukes, inheritors of both a legacy of wealth and a tradition of cultural patronage, understood that the brush and the chisel could be as powerful as the sword and the scepter. If Cosimo I had secured Florence through force, he maintained it through spectacle. His descendants grasped this lesson as well. The Medici Dynasty, like their banking ancestors, wielded art as propaganda, transforming Florence into a theater of dynastic legitimacy. In doing so, they elevated not only themselves, but also the cultural memory of an entire city. Florence, under Medici ducal rule, was no longer a republic of fiercely independent guilds and outspoken citizens. It was a stage upon which the grandeur of the dynasty was displayed. Cosimo I, determined to solidify his image as more than a usurper, invested heavily in monumental projects. Chief among these was the Uffizi, constructed between 1560 and 1580 by Giorgio Vasari. Originally intended as administrative offices, its sweeping corridors and imposing architecture communicated both order and magnificence. Later transformed into a gallery, it became one of the greatest repositories of Renaissance art, housing works commissioned and collected by the Medici over generations. The building itself, with its rational geometry and vast proportions, proclaimed the triumph of authority disguised as civic service. Cosimo also commissioned the Palazzo Vecchio's transformation into a ducal residence. Its medieval fortress, once a symbol of Florence's republican government, was refashioned into a palace of splendor, adorned with frescoes depicting Medici victories and virtues. This act was more than interior decoration. It was an appropriation of Florence's republican past, the absorption of its symbols into the Medici mythos. The very stones that once echoed with the voices of elected officials now bore the painted triumphs of hereditary rulers. Patronage extended beyond architecture. Cosimo I and his successors fostered a golden age of art and science under their ducal court. Giorgio Vasari, court painter and architect, became the chronicler of Renaissance greatness, his lives of the artists elevating Florence's painters, sculptors, and architects into legends. In his pages, the Medici appeared not merely as clients, but as divine patrons, destined to guide genius into creation. Their role in nurturing figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli in earlier generations was woven into a narrative of dynastic inevitability. The Medici dukes also embraced spectacle as a political tool. Public festivals, elaborate processions, and theatrical performances were staged with unprecedented magnificence. Weddings were celebrated not merely as family unions, but as civic events, designed to dazzle citizens and foreign dignitaries alike. In 1565, the wedding of Francesco I de' Medici and Joanna of Austria transformed Florence into a living stage. The festivities included pageants, tournaments, and plays staged in specially designed theaters, blending art with political theater. The city itself became a canvas upon which the Medici painted their authority, dazzling subjects into acceptance. Francesco I, though less politically adept than his father Cosimo, advanced Medici patronage into new realms. A lover of science and alchemy, he established the studiolo in the Palazzo Vecchio, an intimate chamber filled with paintings, cabinets, and instruments reflecting his eclectic curiosity. Here, art and science mingled in symbolic harmony, each piece reflecting the Medici fascination with the secrets of nature. It was a space that embodied the Renaissance ideal of knowledge as power, yet it also revealed the Medici penchant for secrecy and control. This intertwining of art, power, and identity reached its apotheosis in religious commissions. Churches across Florence bore the mark of Medici patronage. The family tombs in San Lorenzo, designed by Michelangelo, were not mere burial places but monuments to dynastic continuity. Statues of dukes reclined like Roman emperors, their faces serene yet commanding, carved in marble to outlast the centuries. In the frescoed chapels, biblical themes were subtly entwined with Medici imagery, suggesting divine sanction for their rule. But Medici's splendor was not solely inward-looking. They were keenly aware of their image abroad. Artworks were gifted to foreign courts, alliances cemented through the exchange of cultural treasures. Galileo Galilei, patronized by the Medici, dedicated his discoveries to them, naming the moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars. Through science as much as through art, the Medici stamped their name across Europe, intertwining dynastic ambition with the progress of knowledge. Florence's citizens lived within this constructed spectacle daily. Statues, fountains, and frescoes reminded them constantly of Medici authority. Every festival reinforced the narrative that the family was not merely ruling Florence, but embodying its greatness. Yet beneath the splendor, dissent simmered. Intellectuals whispered of lost liberties. Exiles in other Italian cities plotted and lamented, but within Florence itself, the careful choreography of art and spectacle muted rebellion. Beauty had become a political weapon, and few could resist its seduction. Still, splendor had its costs. The Medici dukes, particularly Francesco I and his brother Ferdinando I, spent lavishly to maintain their image. The balance between cultural investment and political control was delicate, and the line between magnificence and decadence was perilously thin. To dazzle was to dominate, but also to invite envy and critique. Florence's wealth, once a collective enterprise of merchants and guilds, was increasingly channeled into sustaining the image of one family. By the end of the 16th century, Florence had become synonymous with Medici magnificence. The Republic was a memory, preserved in history books and the laments of a dwindling opposition. In its place stood a dynasty that ruled with the brush and the festival as much as with laws and soldiers. The Medici dukes had not only secured their power, but woven themselves into the very cultural DNA of Florence, ensuring that to admire the city was to admire its rulers. Patronage and splendor thus served as the Medici's crown. They did not need coronations or thrones of gold. Their throne was Florence itself, its streets, palaces, and churches resplendent with their mark. The family that had once bought influence with loans now purchased eternity with beauty, each fresco and facade a silent proclamation. The Medici were Florence, and Florence was the Medici. Behind the painted ceilings, gilded chapels, and festival processions of Medici Florence lurked another reality, a court where whispers carried the weight of daggers and suspicion clung to every shadow. The dynasty that had so carefully cultivated magnificence was also consumed by intrigue. For every fresco that proclaimed their glory, there was a rumor of poison, a sudden death, or a betrayal within the palace walls. To rule Florence was not only to command armies or commission cathedrals, it was to survive the serpentine coils of politics and family rivalry. Francesco I de' Medici, son of Cosimo I, epitomized this paradox. Where his father had been shrewd, disciplined, and pragmatic, Francesco was eccentric, aloof, and often distracted by his obsessions with alchemy and science. He established laboratories in his private apartments, where he experimented with distillations, minerals, and herbal concoctions. Courtiers whispered that his chambers reeked of sulfur and strange fumes, as though the Grand Duke sought secrets forbidden to ordinary men. Yet while Francesco pursued mysteries in his studiolo, the political life of Tuscany faltered, and resentment against his reign simmered. The most infamous story of intrigue under Francesco's rule was the fate of his first wife, Joanna of Austria. She arrived in Florence in 1565 as part of a dynastic alliance with the Habsburgs. Pale, pious, and foreign, she never found a home in Florence, nor the affections of her husband. Francesco openly paraded his mistress, Bianca Capello, a Venetian of extraordinary beauty and ambition. Bianca wielded influence over Francesco with a subtle mastery, creating factions at court between those who supported her rise and those who clung to Joanna's royal dignity. When Joanna died suddenly in 1578, the rumors began at once. Official accounts claimed she succumbed to illness during pregnancy, but Florentines whispered that Bianca, or even Francesco himself, had engineered her death through poison. The exact cause remains debated to this day, but the gossip that spread across Europe stained the Medici reputation. Within months, Francesco and Bianca were married, a union that infuriated both the Habsburgs and many Florentine nobles. Their lavish wedding could not disguise the unease that shadowed it. Bianca was a commoner, an outsider, and to many, a usurper. The specter of poison did not end with Joanna. In 1587, Francesco and Bianca both fell ill at their villa in Poggio a Caiano. Within days, they were dead. Officially, they had succumbed to malaria, a disease endemic to Tuscany's marshlands. Yet rumors again swirled. Had Francesco's brother Ferdinando, who stood next in line, orchestrated their deaths? Later forensic studies have offered conflicting conclusions. Some indicating traces of arsenic, others supporting the malaria explanation. The truth remains uncertain. But in the theater of Medici politics, truth was less important than perception. Ferdinando became Grand Duke, and suspicion was woven into the narrative of succession. These tales of intrigue were not isolated scandals, but part of a broader pattern that plagued the Medici Dynasty. The very structure of their court, modeled on those of European monarchs, created an environment ripe for jealousy, ambition, and betrayal. Servants, courtiers, and family members jostled for influence, their fortunes rising and falling with the shifting affections of the Duke. A misplaced word, a misjudged alliance, or a whispered accusation could spell ruin or death. The Medici also contended with external plots. Florence was never free from the eyes of rival Italian states, the Papacy, and foreign dynasties like the Habsburgs and Bourbons. Every marriage was a political game, every treaty a potential trap. Allies could become enemies overnight, and the Medici, despite their wealth and patronage, remained vulnerable to the tides of European power struggles. Poison was not merely a metaphor. It was a weapon employed across courts in Italy and beyond, its presence both feared and expected. Perhaps most chilling was the way intrigue seeped into family itself. Cousins plotted against cousins, brothers against brothers. Even the church, into which many Medici sons were placed as cardinals or popes, became a battlefield of familial rivalry. The line between faith and politics blurred when Medici cardinals maneuvered not for spiritual salvation, but for dynastic advantage. The Vatican itself was no sanctuary from the Medici's web of ambition. Yet through scandal and suspicion, the Medici endured. If Francesco's reign was marked by whispers of poison, Ferdinando I's accession demonstrated the family's resilience. Skilled, pragmatic, and determined, Ferdinando restored stability to Tuscany, expanded naval power, and reasserted Medici prestige in Europe. His reign, however, was haunted by the suspicion that he owed his throne to fratricide. That shadow could never fully be dispelled, for in Florence, beauty and blood were entwined. The allure of the Medici court lay precisely in this paradox. Beneath the surface of splendor, danger lurked. Behind every fresco of victory, there was a rumor of betrayal. Citizens who admired the Medici's festivals and art also whispered of poison-laced goblets and secret plots. This duality gave the dynasty its enduring mystique. They were both patrons of genius and players in a deadly game. History remembers the Medici for their contributions to art, science, and politics, but it also remembers them for their scandals. The dynasty's narrative was inseparable from the language of intrigue. To speak of the Medici was to speak of beauty and suspicion in the same breath. Like the alchemical experiments of Francesco, the family transformed base elements, wealth, ambition, secrecy, into the gold of dynastic survival, even as the fumes of corruption threatened to consume them. By the close of the 16th century, Florence had become accustomed to this uneasy balance. Its rulers dazzled with patronage while whispers of poison filled the taverns. The Medici had mastered not only the spectacle of magnificence, but also the theater of fear. And in that theater, they reigned supreme, never kings in name, but monarchs in every other sense. In the corridors of power during the Renaissance, few thrones rivaled that of the Papacy. To rule Florence was one thing. To rule Rome, in theory as God's chosen representative on earth, was to wield a far more formidable power. The Medici, ever attuned to the currents of influence, recognized that control of the Vatican could not only legitimize their secular authority, but extend their dynasty beyond Tuscany into the universal stage of Christendom. Thus began one of the most audacious expansions of Medici ambition, the forging of popes from a family of bankers. The first great triumph came in 1513 with Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ascended the papal throne as Leo X. From the moment of his election, the Vatican became infused with Florentine culture and Medici grandeur. Leo X was a man of cultivated tastes, steeped in humanist learning, and a lover of art, music, and theater. His reign transformed Rome into a spectacle of Renaissance magnificence. He patronized Raphael, encouraged the completion of St. Peter's Basilica, and filled the papal palaces with celebrations that astonished visitors. To contemporaries, it seemed as though the Medici had crowned their long ascent by marrying secular and sacred power. Yet Leo's papacy also revealed the precarious balance between splendor and responsibility. His extravagant spending on feasts, pageants, and commissions drained the papal treasury. In his quest to finance such magnificence, Leo relied heavily on the sale of indulgences, the promise of remission from sin in exchange for money. This practice, long controversial, reached new intensity under his reign, and it sparked a reaction he could not foresee. In 1517, a monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, protesting the abuses of indulgences and calling for reform. The Protestant Reformation was ignited, and though Luther's quarrel extended beyond Leo's policies, it was the Medici Pope who stood at the epicenter of a religious upheaval that would fracture Christendom. The Medici did not retreat from Rome despite this storm. A second family pope emerged in 1523, Giulio de' Medici, a cousin of Leo X, who became Clement VII. Where Leo had reveled in grandeur, Clement was cautious, intelligent, and calculating. Yet his papacy unfolded amid crises that tested him to the core. Europe was riven by the growing Protestant movement, while rival dynasties, the Habsburgs and Valois, fought bitterly for dominance. Clement, attempting to steer a middle path between Charles V of Spain and Francis I of France, found himself caught in a vice of imperial politics. The disaster came in 1527, when imperial troops, many unpaid, desperate, and inflamed with religious fervor, sacked Rome. The Eternal City was reduced to horror. Churches desecrated, palaces looted, and citizens massacred. The Pope himself fled into hiding, humiliated and powerless. To many, the Medici Pope's reign seemed cursed, a divine punishment for corruption and miscalculation. Yet Clement endured. Emerging from catastrophe, he rebuilt his alliances and even secured a legacy through art and politics. Most notably, he arranged the marriage of his niece, Catherine de' Medici, into the French royal line. a union that would one day make her Queen of France and shape the destiny of an entire nation. The Medici papacy did not end with Clement. Later generations produced two more popes, Pius IV, Giovanni Angelo Medici, of a distant Milanese branch, and Leo XI, though their impact was less pronounced. What mattered most was the precedent. A family that began with a modest bank in Florence had enthroned itself not only in palaces, but in the Vatican itself. They had blurred the boundary between secular and sacred, demonstrating that religion could be as much a theater of dynastic power as politics or art. Yet the Medici popes also embodied the contradictions of their family legacy. They were patrons of beauty, but also agents of excess. They strengthened the cultural prestige of Rome while weakening its spiritual authority. Leo X's indulgences helped spark the Reformation. Clement VII's cautious diplomacy brought about Rome's humiliation in the sack of 1527. For all their brilliance and patronage, the Medici popes were symbols of how fragile power could be when ambition collided with forces beyond one's control. Still, they could not be dismissed. To stand in St. Peter's Basilica today and gaze upon Michelangelo's dome is to witness the Medici's imprint upon the church itself. To study the political map of Europe in the 16th century is to recognize how Catherine de' Medici, descended from Clement's ambition, steered France through wars of religion. The papacy gave the family something Florence alone could not, an empire of influence across the Christian world. For the Medici, religion was not a barrier, but an instrument. They saw in the Vatican a stage upon which their dynasty could project itself as eternal, as sacred, as chosen. Even as critics accused them of corruption, they cloaked themselves in the garments of divine authority. To ordinary Florentines, it was astonishing. The sons of bankers, once denied entry into noble ranks, now crowned as vicars of Christ. This fusion of faith and power left a legacy both luminous and troubled. The Medici papacy nourished Renaissance art and architecture, yet it also became a lightning rod for reformers who demanded a purer, simpler faith. The dynasty's venture into the theater of faith revealed not only their audacity, but also the limits of dynastic control. The church was not Florence. Its currents could not be so easily tamed. By the mid-16th century, the Medici had secured their place in both Rome and Florence. They were no longer merely bankers or dukes. They were kings without crowns, popes without dynastic rivals. Yet with each triumph came a cost, and with each rise, a shadow. In the theater of faith, the Medici had won applause and condemnation alike. And as Europe hurtled toward greater wars of religion, their dynasty would be tested anew. The story of the Medici dynasty extended far beyond Florence and Rome. Its threads wove themselves into the fabric of Europe, and none shone more brilliantly, nor cast darker shadows, than Catherine de' Medici. Born in 1519, the daughter of Lorenzo II de' Medici and Madeleine de la Tour de Vergne, Catherine's infancy was marked by tragedy. Both parents died within weeks of her birth, leaving her an orphan at the very moment her bloodline placed her in the web of European politics. She was the last legitimate descendant of the senior Medici line, and her fate would be to carry the family's legacy not in Florence, but in France, where her name would become synonymous with intrigue, survival, and power. Catherine's early life was fragile and uncertain. After her parents' deaths, she fell under the protection of her relative, Pope Clement VII, himself a Medici, who understood the value of binding Florence's fortunes to greater dynasties. To secure alliances, Clement arranged her marriage in 1533 to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of Francis I of France. At the time, Catherine was barely 14 years old, an Italian girl with no wealth or army, thrust into the dazzling but treacherous court of France. For many, her presence was an oddity. Courtiers whispered that she was too plain, too foreign, and too dependent on papal patronage. Yet Catherine possessed something subtler and ultimately more powerful than beauty or immediate prestige, a resilience that would become the hallmark of her reign. Her marriage to Henry began without promise. Henry remained indifferent to her, deeply infatuated instead with his mistress, the elegant and influential Diane de Poitiers. Catherine endured years of humiliation, as Diane not only captured Henry's affections, but also shaped his political decisions. Worse still, For the first decade of marriage, Catherine bore no children, a failure that placed her position in peril. In the cutthroat world of dynastic politics, a queen without heirs was dispensable. There were whispers that she might be set aside, replaced by a bride more fertile. Yet Catherine, desperate to fulfill her role, sought remedies both medical and mystical. She relied on astrologers, midwives, and alchemists, clinging to the hope of preserving her place. Finally, after 10 years of anxiety, she gave birth to a son, followed by 9 more children in rapid succession. Her survival was secured, and her role in French destiny was sealed. When Henry became King Henry II of France in 1547, Catherine ascended as queen consort. Yet even as queen, her influence was limited by Diane's dominance. Catherine observed, listened, and learned, playing the long game that was always the Medici way. It was only after Henry's sudden death in 1559, from a jousting accident that pierced his eye with a splintered lance, that Catherine's true power emerged. As the mother of the young King Francis II, barely 15 at his coronation, Catherine was thrust into the role of Queen Mother, regent in all but name. Her regency unfolded at one of the most volatile moments in French history. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the kingdom, igniting conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots. France became a battleground of religious war, dynastic rivalry, and regional rebellion. Catherine, caught between factions, sought to preserve her sons' thrones and the fragile unity of the crown. Her weapons were diplomacy, cunning, and patience. She convened the Colloquy of Papacy in 1561, attempting to reconcile Catholic and Protestant leaders. Though the effort failed, it revealed her determination to balance, to negotiate, to survive in a storm of fanaticism. Her reign as Queen Mother stretched across the lives of 3 of her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. She became the constant amid their short and troubled reigns, a figure both revered and feared. To her supporters, she was the savior of the Valois line, a woman who held the monarchy together when it might have collapsed entirely. To her enemies, she was a manipulative Italian poisoner, the Black Queen, whose hands dripped with blood. The darkest stain on her legacy was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across France. The massacre followed the marriage of Catherine's daughter, Margaret of Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant who would later become King Henry IV. The union was meant to reconcile Catholic and Protestant factions, but instead it sparked fury and violence. Historians still debate Catherine's role. Some see her as the orchestrator of the massacre, manipulating events to preserve Catholic dominance. Others argue she was swept along by forces beyond her control, powerless to restrain the mob and the militant Catholic factions. The truth, as ever with Catherine, lies in ambiguity. What is certain is that the massacre stained her reputation irreparably, casting her as a symbol of treachery in Protestant memory. Beyond politics, Catherine left her mark on culture. She brought Italian tastes and customs into France, popularizing ballet, introducing Italian culinary refinements, and commissioning magnificent architecture such as the Tuileries Palace. She was a great patron of the arts, much like her Medici ancestors, and she fostered the cultural renaissance of France even as wars consumed the land. She surrounded herself with astrologers, magicians, and scientists, weaving mysticism and learning into her court. To many, she embodied both the grandeur and the menace of Renaissance queenship. Catherine's life was one of perpetual survival. She endured widowhood, the deaths of multiple children, wars of religion, and ceaseless slander. Yet she outlived her enemies and guided her sons through chaos, preserving the monarchy until her death in 1589. By then, the Valois line was faltering, but Catherine had left an indelible imprint on French history. Her descendants, through the marriage alliances she arranged, continued to shape Europe for generations. For the Medici, Catherine's life was the ultimate testament to the dynasty's reach. From bankers in Florence, they had placed one of their own on the throne of France, where she reigned not as a queen consort of beauty, but as a matriarch of endurance. She proved that power was not always about crowns or coronations, but about the ability to survive storms, to bend without breaking, and to wield influence when others faltered. Catherine de' Medici was no saint, nor was she a mere villain. She was a queen who ruled in shadows, embodying both the brilliance and the ruthlessness of her lineage. In her, the Medici legacy crossed borders, transcended Florence, and became European. When Florence crowned itself with the brilliance of the Renaissance, it was the Medici who had nurtured its roots. But by the mid-16th century, the age of the Republic was over. The city that had once prided itself on its independence and civic freedoms was transformed into a hereditary monarchy under the Medici banner. The transformation was not sudden but gradual, born of necessity, opportunism, and the family's inexhaustible instinct for survival. This chapter traces the rise of the Medici from merchant princes of a republic into Grand Dukes of a sovereign Tuscany. The turning point arrived with Cosimo I de' Medici. Born in 1519, he was a distant relative of the older Medici line, a branch considered minor when compared to the ruling Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent. Yet fortune placed him at the center of Florentine politics in 1537, when the assassination of Duke Alessandro de' Medici, himself a controversial ruler imposed by the Papacy and imperial power, left a vacuum. Florence teetered between restoring its republican past or choosing another Medici to maintain stability. At just 17 years old, Cosimo was selected, his youth and inexperience thought to make him malleable to the wishes of Florence's elites. They underestimated him profoundly. Cosimo I proved neither weak nor pliable. From the moment he assumed power, he displayed a shrewd understanding of authority. He consolidated control with efficiency, forging alliances with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who recognized Cosimo as Duke of Florence. This alliance gave Cosimo the legitimacy he needed, though it came at a price. Florence's independence was bound ever more tightly to the orbit of imperial politics. Yet Cosimo balanced this dependence with his own assertive policies, strengthening Florence's military and administrative institutions so that power centered on the Medici household rather than the fragile republican councils. Under Cosimo's rule, Florence expanded its territorial reach. The conquest of Siena in 1555, with the aid of imperial forces, transformed the Medici dominion into something greater than the Florentine Republic had ever been. By absorbing Siena and its surrounding territories, Cosimo laid the foundations for a united Tuscan state. In 1569, Pope Pius V elevated him to the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, a recognition that not only affirmed his authority, but also symbolized the culmination of the Medici's transformation from bankers into sovereign rulers. The once humble family of merchants had become crowned monarchs in all but name, their dynasty stretching across Tuscany's rolling hills, marble quarries, and bustling ports. Cosimo's rule was marked not just by political consolidation, but by cultural ambition. He understood, as his forebears did, that art was power. He commissioned the Uffizi, originally conceived as administrative offices, but destined to become one of the world's greatest art galleries. He patronized artists like Giorgio Vasari, who immortalized the Medici legacy not only in frescoes, but in his monumental Lives of the Artists, which enshrined the family's role as cultural midwives of the Renaissance. Cosimo also fortified Florence, building new defensive walls and strengthening its military infrastructure, ensuring that no uprising could threaten his authority. Yet Cosimo was no mere tyrant. He instituted reforms that stabilized the Tuscan economy, encouraged trade, and fostered agriculture. He modernized governance, creating centralized institutions that outlived him. His reign, though marked by iron-fisted control, also brought a measure of peace and prosperity to Tuscany after decades of turbulence. By the time of his death in 1574, he had transformed Florence from a fragile republic into a duchy with aspirations of permanence. Cosimo's successors continued to entrench Medici power. Francesco I, his eldest son, inherited the Grand Ducal throne. Though less politically adept than his father, Francesco expanded the family's patronage of science and alchemy. He established the Medici Theater of Natural Philosophy and filled the Grand Ducal collections with marvels of nature, technology, and art. His private life, scandalous and fraught with rumors of poisoning, added a layer of intrigue that echoed through European courts. The Medici Dynasty, however, was not immune to decline. Later Grand Dukes varied in ability, some content to enjoy the wealth and grandeur inherited from their predecessors rather than expand upon it. But the structures established by Cosimo I ensured that the dynasty endured. For nearly 2 centuries, the Medici Grand Dukes ruled Tuscany, blending monarchy with the city's mercantile past, creating a state that bore their unmistakable imprint. As Grand Dukes, the Medici turned Florence into a jewel of absolutism wrapped in Renaissance splendor. They presided over a court that rivaled the greatest in Europe, hosting ambassadors, artists, and scientists. Their rule was not without opposition. Republican sentiment never entirely disappeared, but they had reshaped the political reality so completely that Florence could never return to the world of civic freedom and rotating magistracies. Instead, it became a family possession, a dynasty cloaked in the language of sovereignty, consecrated by papal approval and imperial recognition. The Medici had thus achieved what many merchant dynasties could only dream of, the transformation of financial power into hereditary monarchy. From the counting houses of Florence to the palaces of Tuscany, their ascent was complete. Yet with monarchy came new challenges. The responsibilities of governance, the temptations of luxury, and the stagnation of inherited power would test the family's resilience in ways banking never had. Cosimo I's triumph signaled both the zenith of Medici ambition and the beginning of its long twilight. For in securing Tuscany under their banner, the Medici had achieved permanence, but also exposed themselves to the slow erosion that time brings to all dynasties. Their story, however, remained one of audacity unparalleled. From republic to duchy, from bankers to grand dukes, from Florence's civic halls to the marble courts of Tuscany. The Medici had long understood that power was more than the clink of coins or the thrust of armies. It was also the ability to shape how men and women perceived the world itself. From their earliest patronage of art and architecture, they had claimed mastery not only of political life but of imagination. Yet in the 17th century, a new frontier emerged, one not of marble domes or painted frescoes, but of stars, planets, and the very laws of nature. Into this realm stepped Galileo Galilei, and once again the Medici extended their hand. Born in Pisa in 1564, Galileo grew up in a world shaped by Medici power. He studied mathematics and natural philosophy, challenging the dominant Aristotelian models of motion and astronomy. When he first heard rumors of a Dutch invention, a crude telescope that magnified distant objects, he set about constructing his own. The device he produced in 1609 was not only more powerful, but also revolutionary, for with it Galileo turned his gaze toward the heavens. There he saw things no human eye had ever truly comprehended: craters and mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus, and most dramatically, for small stars orbiting Jupiter. These celestial bodies, invisible to the naked eye, undermined centuries of belief that all heavenly motion centered on Earth. Galileo named them the Medicean stars in honor of Cosimo II de' Medici, the young Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was not flattery alone, it was strategy. By tying his discoveries to the Medici name, Galileo offered them cosmic immortality, a linkage between dynastic power and celestial truth. The gesture was shrewd. In 1610, Galileo was invited to Florence as court philosopher and mathematician, securing not only patronage but also protection. In turn, the Medici could boast that the heavens themselves bore testimony to their grandeur. Cosimo II's court became a haven for Galileo's genius. Here he lectured, wrote, and demonstrated his findings. Aristocrats, clerics, and scholars gathered to peer through his telescope, astonished at the evidence before their eyes. Galileo dedicated his treatise Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, to Cosimo, intertwining the Medici legacy with the birth of modern astronomy. What the family had once done for painters and sculptors, they now did for science. They nurtured its flowering, invested it with prestige, and bound it to their name. Yet Galileo's discoveries were as dangerous as they were dazzling. To declare that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but one planet among many threatened not only Aristotelian philosophy, but the very foundations of Catholic orthodoxy. The Medici, ever pragmatic, offered support but also caution. Their court could not shield Galileo entirely from the growing storm in Rome. where suspicion of Copernican ideas hardened into outright hostility. Still, the protection they afforded gave him the freedom to advance his research at a moment when silence might otherwise have been safer. The alliance between Galileo and the Medici was mutually beneficial. For Galileo, Medici patronage legitimized his work and gave it a platform. For the Medici, the telescope became an emblem of enlightened rule. They could claim not only to guard Tuscany, but to shepherd humanity's understanding of the cosmos itself. In an age when dynasties sought to demonstrate divine favor, what greater endorsement could there be than stars named in their honor? Cosimo II's premature death in 1621 cast a shadow over this golden moment. His widow, Maria Maddalena of Austria, and his mother, Christina of Lorraine, assumed regency for the young Ferdinand II. Both women were sympathetic to Galileo, but the political climate had shifted. Rome's hostility grew more intense, and Galileo found himself under increasing scrutiny. Even so, Ferdinand II continued to value him, keeping alive the link between Medici prestige and the daring of scientific inquiry. The Medici patronage of Galileo symbolized a broader truth about their dynasty, that their power lay not merely in wealth or governance, but in their ability to embody the spirit of their age. Just as they had once propelled Renaissance art into its golden dawn, they now stood at the birth of the scientific revolution. The relationship was not without limits. Dynastic caution tempered scientific radicalism, but it demonstrated the family's enduring instinct to align themselves with whatever force was reshaping the world. Galileo's later trial and condemnation by the Inquisition in 1633 marked a tragic turn. The Medici, cautious of offending Rome, could not protect him fully. Yet the connection had already been forged. The Medicean stars still circled Jupiter, eternal witnesses to a moment when dynastic ambition and scientific curiosity met under the Florentine sky. For centuries to come, the Medici name would be spoken not only in galleries and palaces, but in observatories and universities, etched into the very fabric of the cosmos. Thus, the dynasty's story, once bound to banks and basilicas, became also a story of telescopes and planets. In Galileo, the Medici found a mirror of themselves, bold, controversial, and transformative, reshaping the way humanity saw its place in the universe. And in the Medici, Galileo found the patrons who lifted his discoveries beyond the realm of whispers into the immortal language of stars. The Medici, who had once embodied Florence's vitality and the Renaissance's brilliance, began their long descent into decline by the 17th century. The centuries of patronage, diplomacy, and financial daring that had sustained them gave way to caution, insularity, and decay. What had once been a family of bold bankers who could defy popes and crown kings now hardened into a courtly dynasty, bound by ceremony rather than creativity. The slow unraveling of their fortune and influence would mirror Florence's own fading centrality in the wider European stage. The signs of decline were subtle at first. Under Cosimo II, patron of Galileo, Florence still breathed with intellectual energy, though his early death left the duchy under regency. The young Grand Duke, Ferdinand II, inherited a realm increasingly constrained by foreign pressures. Spain, France, and the rising power of the Habsburgs encircled Italy, treating it as a chessboard for dynastic struggle. Florence, once the heart of commerce and ideas, became a pawn in games decided far beyond Tuscany's borders. The Medici still held wealth, but the banking empire that had once stretched across Europe had long vanished. Trade routes shifted westward after the discovery of the Americas, draining Italy's mercantile dominance. The Florentine economy, once bursting with textiles and finance, stagnated. The grand projects of construction and patronage became fewer, more symbolic gestures than engines of renewal. Without a thriving economy or expanding influence, the Medici courts grew insular, their rulers more concerned with preserving dignity than advancing power. Cultural patronage remained a hallmark of the dynasty, but even here the flame dimmed. Ferdinand II supported scientific inquiry, but with caution, especially after Galileo's condemnation by the Inquisition. His successors would sponsor artists and musicians, yet the works produced lacked the epic-defining force of the earlier Renaissance masters. Where once the Medici had propelled Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, and Leonardo to transform the world's imagination, now they patronized competent but secondary figures. The great surge of creativity that had made Florence the envy of Europe dwindled into elegant but repetitive ornamentation. As the dynasty advanced through the 17th century, its rulers became more fragile and detached. Cosimo III, who reigned from 1670 to 1723, embodied this decline. Deeply pious and personally austere, he governed with a rigidity that alienated his subjects. His religious zeal colored his policies, curbing freedoms and driving away the cosmopolitan vibrancy that had once defined Florence. Taxes increased, trade withered further, and foreign visitors remarked on a city that seemed locked in the past, clinging to faded glories. The grandeur of the Medici palaces stood in stark contrast to the economic malaise of the populace. Cosimo III also suffered from personal misfortune. His marriage to Marguerite Louise d'Orleans, a cousin of the French king Louis XIV, began as a promising alliance but quickly descended into acrimony. Marguerite despised Florence, resented her husband, and eventually fled back to France, leaving behind a fractured family. Their children offered little hope. The eldest, Ferdinand, lived a dissolute life and died without heirs. The younger, John Gaston, languished in melancholy and detachment, spending much of his life estranged from courtly duties. The Medici, once famed for their vibrant family alliances and shrewd marriages, now faced extinction through dynastic sterility. By the time John Gaston ascended as the last male Medici Grand Duke in 1723, the family's decline was unmistakable. He ruled for 14 years but took little interest in governance, preferring seclusion and indulgence in his private life. Yet paradoxically, his reign brought a measure of relief to his subjects, for he rolled back some of his father's oppressive measures. Taxes eased, and the rigid religiosity of Cosimo III gave way to a more tolerant atmosphere. But John Gaston's detachment could not revive the city's fortunes, and with no children to succeed him, Florence's destiny slipped further from Medici control. The impending extinction of the line raised urgent questions across Europe. Who would inherit Tuscany when the Medici were gone? The fate of the duchy became entangled in the War of the Spanish Succession and subsequent treaties, where great powers carved up Italian territories without regard for local will. In 1737, with John Gaston's death, the male line of the Medici ended. Tuscany passed to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, husband of Maria Theresa of Austria, ushering in a new era of Habsburg rule. The last Medici, however, were not forgotten. Anna Maria Luisa, John Gaston's sister and the final heir of the family, negotiated the Patto di Famiglia, a remarkable agreement that bequeathed the Medici art collections to the people of Florence on the condition they never leave the city. With this act, she ensured that while the dynasty might vanish, its cultural legacy would remain forever entwined with Florence. The Uffizi, the Pitti Palace, and countless treasures became public patrimony, preserving the Medici as guardians of beauty even as their political power dissolved. Thus, the Medici Dynasty, which had risen from the counting tables of bankers to the thrones of Tuscany, ended not with conquest or assassination but with exhaustion. Their decline was not a collapse, but a fading, a slow erosion of vitality until the line simply withered away. They had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, shaping not only a city but the trajectory of Western civilization. Their fall reminds us that even the most dazzling dynasties cannot escape the cycles of history. And yet, though the Medici lost their crown, they achieved something kings often fail to secure: immortality of memory. Their name remains synonymous with art, with the Renaissance, with Florence itself. Their decline was real, but their legacy endures, woven into the very stones of the city and the imagination of the world. The Medici dynasty's extinction in 1737 marked the end of a bloodline, but not the end of its influence. To speak of Florence without invoking the Medici is nearly impossible. Their fingerprints linger in its palaces, its galleries, its churches, and its very identity. Though they never wore a crown in the traditional sense of European monarchs, their power transcended the visible trappings of kingship. They were not kings by name, but in effect, they commanded armies, dictated policies, brokered marriages, and crowned popes. They were monarchs of influence rather than title, their rule more subtle, yet no less profound. Florence, the city-state that had birthed their fortune, was transformed under their stewardship into the beating heart of the Renaissance. They had overseen a period where intellect, beauty, and ambition converged to produce achievements unrivaled in Western history. From the dome of Brunelleschi to the frescoes of Botticelli, from the political insights of Machiavelli to the visions of Galileo, the Medici's patronage created a tapestry of genius that still dazzles centuries later. Their dynasty demonstrated how wealth, when channeled into art and knowledge, could elevate humanity's imagination rather than simply secure personal glory. Their legacy extended beyond art into the shaping of modern institutions. The Medici Bank had pioneered practices of double-entry bookkeeping, credit, and international finance, innovations that foreshadowed the rise of modern capitalism. Their political maneuvering redefined the role of power in an age before the modern nation-state. Through careful marriages and alliances, they ensured their presence was felt not only in Florence but across the courts of Europe, influencing Spain, France, and even the Holy Roman Empire. In the Vatican, where they placed 4 popes, their imprint was unmistakable. Sometimes noble, sometimes corrupt, but always transformative. What makes the Medici story extraordinary is not simply their wealth or their reign, but their duality. They were both patrons and tyrants, protectors of beauty and wielders of cruelty, visionaries and schemers. They embodied the contradictions of Renaissance humanism itself, where the divine and the earthly, the intellectual and the material, were always in tension. Their ability to balance these contradictions allowed them to endure for centuries, even as rivals fell. The Medici were never content with survival. They aspired to immortality, and in many ways, they achieved it. By the time Anna Maria Luisa secured the Patto di Famiglia, ensuring that the Medici art collections would remain in Florence, the dynasty had achieved a final, lasting triumph. In death, they guaranteed that their name would be eternally tied to the city's cultural grandeur. It was not a crown or a throne that immortalized them, but the preservation of beauty and knowledge for generations to come. The Uffizi Gallery, which today houses treasures from their collections, stands as a silent monument to their foresight, a reminder that power fades, but art endures. The Medici also serve as a cautionary tale. Their rise was built on audacity, risk, and bold vision. Their decline on complacency, excess, and detachment. In their arc, one sees the pattern of countless dynasties, the spark of innovation that ignites ascendancy, followed by the slow dimming of that fire. Yet unlike so many who vanished into obscurity, the Medici transformed their temporal power into cultural immortality. Their example illustrates how greatness is not measured solely by conquest or dominion, but by the ability to inspire, to leave behind something that continues to shape lives long after the family itself has disappeared. In Florence today, their presence is everywhere. The Medici coat of arms, the 6 balls on a gold shield, still adorns buildings across the city, a silent testament to their former dominion. Tourists flock to the Uffizi, the Pitti Palace, the Medici chapels, walking the same halls where dukes once plotted and artists once dreamed. In those places, one feels that the Medici are not truly gone. They are a whisper in the marble, a shadow in the frescoes, a resonance in the chime of church bells. The Medici story remains one of the most compelling sagas in human history, a tale of ambition, genius, corruption, piety, cruelty, and above all, legacy. They remind us that power is fleeting, but vision can endure. They remind us that one family, rising from the world of bankers, could alter the course of art, science, and politics forever. They remind us that while crowns may glitter and fade, the works of human imagination, the cathedrals, the paintings, the ideas, shine with a light that time cannot extinguish. Thus the Medici, kings without crowns, achieved what so many crowned rulers could not, a dynasty whose influence transcended its extinction, whose wealth purchased not just dominion but memory, and whose name, centuries after its decline, remains synonymous with the triumph of human creativity. The story of the Medici is not simply the story of a family, but of human ambition in its most vivid and contradictory form. They began as bankers in a provincial city and rose to command the destinies of Florence, Italy, and even the Papacy. They wielded no formal crown, yet their influence surpassed that of many kings. Their saga demonstrates how power can emerge not only through armies and thrones, but through money, intellect, and imagination. They were proof that wealth, when combined with vision, could reshape the world. Yet the Medici were never saints. They were both benefactors and tyrants, patrons of genius and architects of intrigue. Their hands bore the ink of ledgers and the blood of rivals. They maneuvered with cunning, and at times with cruelty, but their ambition birthed something greater than themselves, the cultural flowering we call the Renaissance. Without their patronage, would Michelangelo's David stand in Florence? Would the dome of Brunelleschi crown Santa Maria del Fiore? Would Galileo have dared to look at the heavens through his telescope? Their flaws make them human. Their vision makes them immortal. Their story also carries a warning. Dynasties rise when they innovate and fall when they forget the hunger that first propelled them. The Medici Bank, once the most powerful financial institution in Europe, collapsed under the weight of mismanagement and arrogance. Later dukes, more concerned with pleasure than statecraft, squandered the vitality of the family's legacy. Yet, even in decline, they made a final gesture of immortality. By preserving their collections for Florence through the Patto di Famiglia, Anna Maria Luisa ensured that their dynasty's name would live on, not in power, but in beauty. In that choice lies a profound lesson. Political power fades, but art, knowledge, and culture endure. Today, when we walk through the Uffizi, gaze at Botticelli's Primavera, or trace the lines of Michelangelo's sculptures, we are not merely admiring works of art. We are participating in the Medici legacy. They remind us that patronage, the act of supporting ideas and creators, can shape the future more deeply than conquest. Their story tells us that influence is not always about ruling, but about enabling others to create, discover, and dream. The Medici crown was not wrought in gold, but in memory. It rests not on a throne, but in the collective imagination of humanity. They remind us that what we build with vision can outlast us, that legacy is not only measured in monuments of stone, but in the ideas and beauty that ripple outward through generations. In their triumphs and failures, the Medici offer us a mirror. Power without vision withers, but vision, even born of flawed ambition, can illuminate centuries. As Florence still glows with their imprint, the Medici continue to whisper across time. Greatness lies not in possession, but in creation, not in crowns, but in the ability to leave behind something that endures. Their dynasty proves that while thrones crumble and bloodlines end, the human spirit, when it dares to imagine and to invest in imagination, can outlive death itself.